Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our first New York ARSC meeting for the year 2018, our third meeting of the season. And tonight is a rather special one because we're going to talk about a gentleman who was essentially, I would say, on both sides of the law, in the sense of being a lawyer as well as being a pirate of recordings.
A judge.
And a judge, too, yet.
He wasn't.
Yes. We're referring to, gentlemen, please, I'm talking, thank you. Referring to a gentleman by the name of Renato Kaka-mo. I heard about him through mutual friends 35 years ago, and he was considered the center of where every underground recording coming from Italy and from Europe originated. And he passed away, it's 2005, was it?
2011.
2011, excuse me. He passed away in 2011. And I have two gentlemen here who knew him very, very well and wanted to give a program of some of the treasures that he had recorded and circulated, and well as talk about the man. Sitting directly next to me is Jeffrey Swann, renowned pianist, and next to Jeffrey is Gary Thalheimer, who is the co-chair of our steering committee for the New York chapter, head of Gary Tall Music, and a record collector for how many decades?
Since 1912.
Since 1912?
I'm sorry.
What?
1942.
42. Okay, that's much better.
but
how do you collect
Just seems
18
longer.
years before you're born? Now, that's what I'd like to know.
No, but it's much more impressive, you know.
Yeah, I know it is. It's cockeyed wonders, we used to call them. Anyway, let me introduce both of them. Jeffrey, tell everybody about yourself, and then hand it over to Gary, and then we'll start the evening concerning our subject.
I'm a concert pianist. That's what I do for a living, although I also teach now at NYU. And I was born in Arizona and grew up in Texas, and came to Juilliard when I was 17 and lived in New York ever since. And I won several big international piano competitions, the Queen Elizabeth competition in Brussels, and I won a big competition in Milano at La Scala in 1975 when I was 22. That was organized partly by Renato Caccamo and in honor of an Italian pianist who will be a central person in our talk tonight, Dino Ciani, who had died tragically at age 32 in a car accident. And I ended up going to this competition due to Renato's extraordinary persistence, and we became great friends then. And so Italy has become was my second home. Actually, I was for many years director of a festival there and ran a big concert series in Pisa and played, you know, I still go to Italy several times a year and have done so ever since '75. But I've remained a New Yorker, tried and true, and anyway, it's a great pleasure and privilege, really, to talk about Renato, who was a pretty extraordinary person because there were so many facets to his life, which I'll try to get into. Gary?
Most of you know me. I'm Gary Thalheimer, and I've been, as corrected, a record collector since 1942 when I was given my first ones, although I did have family in the record business. My uncle, who left Germany for France in 1933, had been sales manager of Electrola until the Nazis came in. And I think my parents had some white label pressings of things, but I wasn't old enough to play them at that time. I started Gary Tall Music when I retired from being marketing director at a medical company most of my life, and started Gary Tall Music to sell recordings to libraries. I retired again sort of a few years ago when the building I was in was converted, and I still have a few customers large customers to whom I sell recordings, but primarily I put out a monthly newsletter listing
which you
new
can-
releases,
You can find the copy of it as you leave.
some commentary. It's designed primarily for music libraries and major collections from private individuals. There are sample copies up there,
Right.
and you're welcome to help yourself. I've also done some reviews for the OSC publications and started doing reviews while I was in the Army when I wrote a couple of letters from Tokyo for Irving Kolodin at the Saturday Review of Music, their record section. So,
Okay.
I've known
Yeah, oh.
Renato
Oh, I'm sorry.
from somewhere in the early 60s. I started taping in 1954, and I've been doing taping and trading ever since. And I'll turn it over to Jeffrey at this point.
Well, actually, turn it over to me because I'll just start everything.
Sorry.
And just say, all right, gentlemen, who is Renato CACCAMO? And how did each of you meet him? Through whom and how long ago and all that?
Let me,
Go
can I
ahead.
start? You don't mind if I start? I mean, I met him after you, but I knew him a lot better. Well, for linguistic reasons as much as anything else, because Renato's English was essentially incomprehensible, I would say.
Yeah.
And his Italian wasn't great either. Okay, let me just. Renato came from. Renato was born in '33 and grew up. I think the background is important because it tells a lot about what kind of man he was and what motivated him. He was from the Deep South. He was from a little town called Siderno in Calabria, and his family were very much gentry. One of the things he would always emphasize, his father was a doctor, but he didn't practice. He only had a few, sort of chosen customers, because you didn't work for a living if you were gentry. But it was really very backwards. I mean, this was especially during the war, which is when he was a boy. And Renato loved music from the start, although he was very clear, as he always said, that in the world from which he came, there were three possible professions. You could be law, medicine, or the church. Renato certainly wasn't going to go into the church, and his older brother was already doing medicine, so Renato went into law. But he discovered music very young. There was a violinist in town. And this is a very interesting story because I think it sort of pre-shadows what became his passion for finding performances for tape, and then later on also when he became a book collector. They had no music. They had like 3 copies of music, and there was like no music stores in southern Italy in the way down there in the 1940s. And like somebody's uncle found some music in an old piano bench, and there was like the Spring Sonata, Beethoven, and something else. And he said that this incredible joy, this discovery, this treasure that he and his friend could play. And I think this very much maybe was the sort of the foundation of his passion. So then he moved to Rome to study law, and that was the big eye-opener for him. And actually, I think the big seminal event in his life from a musical standpoint was when Furtwängler came to Rome in the early 50s, right around the time Renato got there. And I think that made an enormous impression on him. And we're going to listen to something from that period in just a second. But the real collecting started after he moved into Milan. When he finished he won some big competition to become a judge in Milan, and he moved to Milan, which is, a southerner in Milan that's a big stretch. And he never lost the accent. He kind of ostentatiously kept it. But he went on, we'll talk about this later, but he went on in Milan to become the president of the Court of Appeals, probably the most powerful judge in Italy, who wrote all the sentences of the big cases, the big scandal cases, the political cases that condemned, for instance, 2 ex-prime ministers, 3 ex-mayors of Milan, so lots of mafia cases. My mother was not happy when I stayed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nights at his apartment. It was my base. Anyway, I met him, because of Dino Ciani. And maybe we should do this more chronologically. We'll get to that.
Whatever
Yeah.
you want to do. You tell me what you want to play. And
Whatever.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let's do this chronologically. So let's do, I think the first thing would be, let's hear some of the Furtwängler.
All right, well, Gary, you should explain the source of this little darling you handed me
Okay.
and how it came to be. Could
Like-
you move a little closer to the mic? Thank you.
Okay.
I don't,
Jeff is fine.
Like pretty much everyone who knows Renato, knew Renato, the introduction came through one or another of our mutual friends, and it seems that everybody who was a major collector back in the late 50s and early 60s knew somebody who knew Renato. So his reputation certainly preceded him, and that reputation was both good and bad. He was a very good friend, and I met him in the early 60s, and one year I was traveling in Italy, and I spent an evening with him. Actually, I was not in Milan, I was in Rome, and he said, "Why don't you come up overnight and you can take the morning train back?" So I did. We had dinner. I spent the evening and actually the night at his house, talking most of the night. And he was a fascinating person, very interesting, and the only problem was his feelings about recordings. While he was the ultimate pirate, he was also the anti-pirate, in that he did not like to give anyone material that he had recorded out of his collection, and generally was known for messing up whatever tapes he gave to people. There was always something wrong with it. And in my case, I never got a defective tape from him. What I did get initially was a sampler, a 5-inch reel of 5 or 10-minute bits of Furtwängler, starting out with the announcements from all the operas at the Salzburg Festival in the early 50s, and the first few minutes of the overtures, whether it was Don Giovanni or Figaro or Freischütz. There was really an interesting and infuriating at the same time collection of things, which occupied a 5-inch reel with no breaks or markings as to how long they were or any details. The details Furtwängler collectors know. But one of the things that was in there was a very good sounding excerpt from the Walküre of the La Scala ring in 1950. I don't know whether you know about the history of that, but apparently this was performed 3 times at La Scala in March of 1950, with recordings made of all 3 performances, none of which were ever broadcast or issued. Rai took all 3 and combined them into one tape from the 3 performances. And with all the tapes that had come off the broadcasts, there were problems of one sort or another, not Renato's making. But he had recordings of all 3 performances at La Scala. And the first thing we're going to hear is the opening of the 2nd act of the Walküre, Furtwängler conducting with Ferdinand Franz as Wotan and Kirsten Flagstad as Brünnhilde.
Great. You can see why this was sort of the beginning of Renato's, I think, passion for recording, and even though this wasn't originally his recording. So he moved to Milan in the late 50s, and I think a bunch of things lined up for the stars that had, first thing, as a judge and a responsible social condition, I think doors were open to him that would not have been opened to most of us sort of, normal schlonks to get in. For one thing, very early on, he was given access to, actually even invited to record everything at La Scala. He had his own box. Because they didn't have an archivist, so he would come in openly with his Nagras and these two big speakers, sit in his own box and record everything, starting in the early 60s. And of course, he took...
You want to tell him the story I told him? About it in the box.
Oh, yeah, no,
He's
sure.
He's sitting there in the box. He always had the seats behind, not in the front, so no one would see him. And he's sitting there with these two mics, and two women are in front, and the opera's about to start, and the two of them go... He took one of the mics and hit her over the head. He said, "Shut up, I'm recording."
But this is a completely... I witnessed things very much like that myself. So anyway, so he became early on good friends with musicians. And this was, I think, the thing that distinguished Renato from a great many collectors. Right from the start, he was friends with Abbado, a very young Abbado, and with a very, very young Pollini. And then he became very good friends with someone I think who was a crucial figure in his life, this young Italian pianist, Dino Ciani. And it's important for me because this is ultimately how I got to know Renato and how I started playing in Italy. Dino Ciani was he was from Genova, actually, from Istria, but brilliant, very personable, must have been extremely charming, cultured person, lots of money, very, very extravagantly talented, kind of the anti-Pollini. He and Pollini were good friends, and yet he was a very sort of spontaneous... He was a student of Cortot. Cortot adored him. Cortot's last great student, really. And Renato and he became very good friends as well, and this sort of also kind of completed the picture, and also got Renato interested in something which he had not been interested in before, which was Italian opera. Renato's love had really been Wagner primarily, but Dino was big in it. Renato said, "I even got to like caballettas," and he was always convinced. This is a funny little personal story. Is that when I first met Renato in 1975, the first day I arrived to do this competition, which we'll get to in a second, but he invited me to meet the two most important women in Milan, as far as he was concerned. One of them was Valli Toscanini, Toscanini's older daughter, whom Renato knew. Renato knew everybody. I mean, when I get to the list of people who I had dinner with in his house, it's like every single musician you've ever heard of, practically, especially singers. But Valli Toscanini, and she gave me a big lecture on not being arrogant, and that's a funny story in itself, but has nothing really to do with Renato. And then he took me to the other great dame of Milan, as far as he was concerned, whom I had never heard of, which was Leila Genscher. And Leila Genscher is a very, very important figure in Renato's life. As a soprano, I don't know how many of you even are that aware of her. Her entire career, really, posthumous career, is due to Renato. Every single operatic record of hers is from tapes of Renato. So anyway, but she was someone who became friends with him through Dino Ciani. We were going to listen, well, I want to get to Ciani some recordings in a second, but did you want to do the CACCAMO tape?
Actually, you know what you want to do? We want to do the Genscher.
Okay, we'll do the Genscher right away. So, and this also shows an aspect of Renato's collection which is unusual. He had a tremendous number. He basically got to the point in the 60s and 70s where he recorded every concert at La Scala, every concert at the Conservatory in Milan, every concert of classical music of any in Milan or anywhere around Milan, and got everything from Rai. And through friends of his wanting access, he got everything pretty much in Italy and in Europe. But Renato himself was extremely proud of his own recordings with his Nagras and stuff like that. Very jealous of them. Just as Gary was saying, later in his life, this is a horrible story, but it's true. I mean, he became he's a true collector. He became an enormous book collector. When he died, he had over 80,000 books. And all over his apartment, he had signs saying, "Who touches my books or tapes, or damages them or steals them will die of AIDS."
Wait a minute.
And may they die also their family members. it's hard to possono morire anche I familiari. I mean, it's very, very strong. He really, really, and there are many, many stories, some of which we can talk about later on the anecdotal level of things. But anyway, one of the things that Renato got into, which I think is a very special part of his collection, and a part which exists but is lost forever probably, is he loved to record music in non-concert occasions, in social events, people playing at parties, people practicing, people, say for instance, Pollini and Dino playing four hands, Claudio Bado and Alexis Weissenberg playing four hands, all drunk as lords probably at the time they did it. There is a particularly memorable one. A lot of these were done at a woman named Nandi Ostali. Nandi Ostali is the editor of Sonsogno that edits almost all the bel canto composers. She's still around, and she was a very good friend of Dino's. That's how I think got into the circle. And after Dino Ciani's, after Muti's debut at La Scala, with Dino Ciani as soloist in the Beethoven choral fantasy, Muti went on home, but Dino, Leila Genscher, Placido Domingo, Maurizio Pollini went over to Nandi Ostali's house and did a complete performance of La Traviata, with Dino playing the piano and singing the chorus, Maurizio Pollini singing the part of Guermont, and Placido and Leila singing their natural parts. So this is an excerpt from that evening. The date of this is December 1969, with Dino at the piano and Leila Genscher, a little over she hadn't sung Violetta in many years when this was done. But this is a very important aspect of Renato's collection. Beautiful touch, though. one of the voices in the background is Polini, the other was Dino. And I think at the very end I heard Nandi, but yeah, it's pretty amazing singing there. We wanted to hear the example of Renato Kaka-moing tapes to make sure that people wouldn't be able to give out copies of them or make records of them, probably. So we wanted you to talk about that, and we'll play an example.
I'll
Yeah.
explain where this came.
I knew people who had gotten tapes from Renato, and as was mentioned, he was very possessive of his tapes. And what he would do would be to, into each tape that he sent to someone, have some sort of defect, like putting your finger on the capstan or the reel as the tape was running to make it slow down and vary in certain sections. And the story I have gotten is that he kept records of where he had the problem in a tape and whom it had gone to, so that if he got this tape from someone else or on a disc, he would know who had gotten that tape with his problem, and, or as some of us have referred to it, a tape that was Kaka-mo'd, and that person would be off his list of contacts permanently.
Lawrence
And-
Whitten, right, yeah.
We've
I
got,
could name you more in Europe, too, but...
I know people who had gotten this kind of tape. Eventually, of course, some of them got together and combined their tapes to remove the CACCAMO spots. So we have a sample of
Yes,
one of these.
I found one in captivity. And believe it or not, it was a tape I had borrowed from C.J. Luton, who we'll have to talk about too, because if it wasn't for C.J., the two of you wouldn't know each other. And he had gotten it from Fred Maroth of Music and Arts. And on the back, Fred wrote, it's January 13th, 1957, Rite of Spring with Motown to Boston. It's a pretty good source. But he wrote on the bottom of it, with Kaka-mo. All right. So here is a live example, one of the few that people talk about that I actually have. It's the beginning of the second part of the Rite of Spring. In the very, very quiet passage, it goes on for about 2 minutes. You'll hear what's going on. All right, let's see. Right. the same thing again, looping. It's still going on very quietly. Could be, could be. Yeah, there are alternate sources to it. But then finally, right about here, it finally clears up. But that was 2 minutes and 30 seconds thereabouts. That's essentially rendering this pretty much unusable.
Yeah, but let me point, I who knew Renato extremely well, one of the things is that Renato was convinced that the overwhelming majority of, this is not going to sound very good in this room, of collectors never really listen to anything. And that if he put it far enough into the piece, he said they'd never get that far anyway. So he would know, but none of them would ever listen to it. And I have to say, to his credit, that he's by and large right. So in many cases, he is right. So no, I mean, I don't know any of you in that way, but certainly some of the collectors that I dealt with in Europe.
One person here who listens to everything he
Yes.
buys, right?
Yes.
Vocal, yeah.
Well, of course, when I first met Renato, he was still doing something which was a very important part of his. One of the reasons I think he was such a central figure in the life and cultural life of Milan. Not a day, and I'm not exaggerating, would go by that he didn't get a call from Muti in person, or a Botto's secretary usually, or some pianist, or like Siggy Weissenberg or Carlos Kleiber, saying, Renato, do you have that performance of the Beethoven Fifth when Furtwängler does the repeat for one time as an experiment? Or Renato, do you have the time that Renato Tebaldi added the high C to whatever aria or something like that? And he invariably did, and he would make them a copy. And of course, this ingratiated him to an enormous number of people. Also, it's a lot of work for him. We're talking in the old days, reel-to-reels and stuff like that. He had a lot of machines. But
Forgive me, how many apartments did he have to store all this?
now, at this time, when I'm talking about, he just had one large apartment in Milan. The apartment, but eventually then bought an apartment in the house next door on the other street, but that was behind his, and did a continuum walkway. And he had, of course, and also eventually 80,000 books. So we're talking, the only person I've ever seen who had triple bookcases, that slid on top of each other, and became like, and he had an apartment in Paris that was full of stuff too, I suppose. His collection, unfortunately, Renato was probably both too superstitious and too paranoid to update his catalog completely. I mean, in the old days, the 70s and early 80s, he still had an enormous catalog. He met me, and I'm a relatively latecomer in his life, in 1975, and I would say that by 1990, Renato was no longer so active in taping. He'd gone on to other interests. Renato had 400 concerts of mine. 400 concerts is a lot of concerts, and if he had 400 concerts of mine, he had more than that of other people.
How many tapes do you think he had? Well, you wouldn't have a better idea.
No, I mean, there's no way even, because also he would do them on super slow, and he would have these, so he had a lot of tapes. So anyway, Dino Ciani became this very, very close friend of Renato's. And I did want, also because of my own personal connection, was through Dino. Now, I never saw Dino, never heard him play, and had never heard of him when Renato invited me to the competition. Dino died at 32 in an automobile accident. Renato, this is typical of him too, he found me. Renato, because of his collection, I had already won the Queen Elizabeth competition in Brussels and played a lot in Eastern Europe, and Poland especially. And Renato had a lot of my recordings already. And he was among the people organizing this competition, and he wanted to get me to come. He didn't have my address, but he found my mother's address in a who's who. My mother was a piano teacher in Texas at the time. And he wrote my mother. My mother thought he was a lunatic. Still has the letter, actually, or had the letter. And but eventually it came to me, and I wasn't interested at first. But then the jury was Abbado Polini, Martha Argerich, Mieczysław Warszawski, Annie Fisher. I mean, it was an unbelievable jury because they'd all been friends of Renato's. And so I ended up going, and luckily I also won. So Dino was an important person for me too. But I think that Dino made in his life, I think 3 records for Deutsche Grammophon, but they've made many, 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 many records posthumously, and especially in France, he's won like Diapason d'Or year after year after year for these records, all from pirated Renato tapes. We're going to hear one now, the Bartók Second Piano Concerto, which is interesting too because it's Muti's debut with a major orchestra. There's Muti and Chani were about the same age. I think Muti's a little bit younger than Chani. This is with Rai in Milan. Rai Milan was not a great orchestra at any time. And Bartók too is a very hard orchestra part. This was also recorded by the Rai, but Renato's own tape is a lot better, the sound, I think. So let's hear a little bit of the second movement of this. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's February 28th, 1969. So track 3. Actually, I personally think that's some of the most beautiful recorded piano sound. I mean, with wonderful sort of round effect. Do we have time to listen to a little bit of the Mozart? Sure. Okay. This is from another orchestral performance. I don't know why we give only orchestral stuff, but anyway, this is Dino. A lot of it is because Renato hated records. And one of the great paradoxes is that hundreds, really, literally, hundreds and hundreds of CDs were made from Renato's tapes. But once that happened, Renato didn't like it anymore. And Renato, when he died, had, this would be harder to guess, but I would say 25,000 CDs. All were still in the original plastic, except maybe 4 or 5 that other people had opened. Renato never owned a CD player in his life. He had the CDs because, for instance, I was at his house one day practicing, and he was off in court. And there was a delivery from Deutsche Grammophon, the entire catalog of every classical CD on all of their their Japanese, their economy, and their mainline thing, of every CD they've ever made at that point, which was in the 90s. Which was, I mean, it was case after case after case after case, dozens and dozens and dozens of cases of CDs. Not one of them was ever played. But he got them in exchange because he gave them tapes of stuff from which they made records. And he would, as a good Southern Italian gentleman, would never take a penny for them, but he wanted something in exchange, so he got these CDs. Now, if you had stolen one of the CDs, he would have noticed it immediately. He may have, and actually, one of the most volcanic eruptions I ever saw from Renato was when a mutual friend of ours, Nikos Felisiotis, who was a record producer who produced many records from Renato's CDs, many Furtwängler records actually, pointed out to Renato one day that many of his CDs, in Deutsche Grammophon, but also Sony and also EMI, were copies of each other because they would be different, editions. It'd be an economy edition or the Japanese edition. He says, look, let me have these extra ones. And Renato would go absolutely volcanic. Don't touch my CDs, they're mine. And he said, but you don't play them. You don't have a machine to play them on. He says, they're mine. Anyway, he liked his things. It was just who he was. A wonderful, wonderful man, but he had his quirks. So let's hear now. This is from Dino Ciani playing with the Pomerigi Musicali, a Milanese chamber orchestra, which still exists and flourishes. The conductor is Gian Andrea Gavazzeni, who was conducted a great deal of La Scala and was, for many, many years, Leila Genscher's companion, let's say. So this is Mozart's C minor piano concerto 491, the last movement. We'll just listen to a bit of it. This is a live performance from March 24th, 1973. So this is just shortly before Dino died. No, a year before he died. It's the middle of the movement. Good. I think the cadenza might be Bay Quarto. I'm not entirely sure. That would be interesting to research. So anyway, let's get to when I come into Renato's life, not too long after this, so they have this competition, and because of the jury, I was convinced to go, and this strange little man with a goatee picked me up at the train, at the air terminal, and immediately I got to his house, I wanted to practice, and he starts taping my practicing. He recorded almost all of my practicing. He recorded every instant of the competition, of every contestant, and all subsequent competitions. From that time, when I came to Italy to play concerts, I always stayed at his house, and he traveled all over Italy, especially in those first years, to tape all my concerts. And in that house, an extraordinary number of people came. Among singers, Franco Corelli, Renato Tebaldi, of course, Leila Genscher, Giuseppe Di Stefano, Gaeta Dimitrova, of course, Pollini. Also, people from the world of theater, Giorgio Strehler, Visconti, just an amazing, he knew all these people. And I think really the enabler was the fact that he was also this important judge. And there would be crammed around this little table he had, this amazing groups of people. One of the people who became, I think, a very close friend of his, especially in these later years, and a close friend of mine, was the Russian pianist Nikita Mogilev, you should say, but everybody said Mogilev, who had an enormous career in Italy. In the States, he mostly played, actually, as the son-in-law of Szigeti, way back. But in Italy, there's no pianist who played as much in Italy as Nikita Mogilev did. And he was a very close friend of Renato's, would always come over with his wife, and he loved to listen. One of the only performers who truly loved to listen to his own recordings. And there's a very funny, very typical Renato anecdote for this. Renato always used to complain that performers, first thing, they never wanted to listen to anybody but themselves, and they only wanted to listen to their best things. But Nikita wanted to listen to everything, of everybody. He was interested. There's a video, for instance, of Nikita with Leila Genscher, and they're playing a bunch of stuff, and Leila, as soon as they start playing anything that's not hers, it's just so obviously bored out of her mind. But Nikita listened to everything with great passion. So when Nikita had been playing a new piece for him, the Liszt Dante Sonata, which is a big virtuoso piece. He played it in Milan, in Torino, in Brescia, Bergamo, Mantova. Renato recorded all the performances, of course. And Nikita wanted to hear one of the best performance. He wanted to hear one. So Nikita had a very charming characteristic, which would be great for making records, although he made very few actually, which is he never made mistakes in the same place. He was by no means a perfect performer, but he would make mistakes in different places. So Renato put together a performance of the Dante Sonata in which he put all of Nikita's mistakes together. He edited all the mistakes. And Nikita would listen to himself, and he would listen. Nikita was such a charming man. He was a wonderful man. And he would listen. If something was good, he would go, and he would say, mais quand je serai mort, on dira, il jouait bien cet homme-là. When I'm dead, they'll say, he played well, this man. So anyway, and when he made a mistake, he'd go like that. So Renato's playing this Dante Sonata, and of course it's just like one. Italians have a great word for a bad mistake, which is called una stecca. It's one stecca after another. Nikita's always spoke French. He spoke perfect American English, but French was his alter ego. So and he finally said, mais je ne savais pas que j'avais fait tant de fausses notes. I didn't know I had made so many mistakes. And Renato didn't have the nerve to tell him what he had done, and only came out after several years. And Nikita said, you mustn't do things like that, Renato. I could get complexes. I thought it's a wonderful and very, very typical story. So let's hear, Renato has, if he had 400 of my concerts, he had 800 of Nikita's, I bet. So this is a little piece, the Borodin Scherzo in A minor, a piece I don't know very well. It's Nikita, October 14th, 1987. Do we know where it's from?
It didn't say.
It's not, it could be Conservatory Milan. It's not Torino because I would recognize the horrible acoustic there.
Yeah, and he announces it too.
Oh yeah, this is an encore. Mm-hmm.
Right.
scherzo de Borozzi per ricordare il centenario di sua morte.
Actually, Renato was visiting me in New York when Nikita died. I remember he was just devastated. I guess, should I talk about his last years and then play some stuff of mine, or shall I play some stuff of mine and then talk about his last years?
Talk about his last
Yeah.
years.
Well, so it's interesting to talk about, and this will all be probably familiar for a lot of you, why after, especially the late 80s, 90s, Renato started recording so much less and really didn't do any sound recordings at all. He died in 2011. I would say in the last 15 years of his life, he made practically no sound recordings. I think one of the problems was he'd become such an institution, and the number of concerts in Milan and Italy had grown so great, especially at that period, that he felt overwhelmed. He was expected to record everything. It became easier not to record anything than to record absolutely everything. Another thing was that because he himself, as judge, had helped pass the laws that made pirating so easy for a short period of time in Italy, and hundreds of records from his collection came out as recordings. But they lost their interest then. They weren't special. He couldn't CACCAMO them to prevent people from making copies anymore. I mean, they weren't private. They weren't the special conquest anymore to him. And so he actually started collecting books instead. He never had the same passion for reading that he had for music. And he started making a tremendous number of camcorder video recordings, which are of no sound interest whatsoever, but are interesting sometimes as, sort of social documents, backstage, things like that, many concerts, but it's not really worth a whole lot. from a standpoint of the music itself. It's the other things around it. And his book collection, Renato was very interested in becoming really a man of culture. So he collected an incredibly large number of art books of really high level, and is a very dear friend of his and of mine, Ede Palmieri, who's one of the Sovrintendente of the Brera, one of the main people of Italian cultural life in northern Italy, helped him get a lot of these books and visit. And he also became an enormous traveler. He traveled a tremendous amount. When I first met Renato, he had been to the States maybe once or twice, but he started coming a lot in the 80s and 90s. A lot, and cheaper to travel. But traveling when you're still recording with those Nagras, those heavy, those things weigh a lot. So it became, as he traveled more. He did. I remember though him coming to Carnegie Hall with his Nagra and his things, and when the usher came and told him that he couldn't do it there, he was outraged. He said, "Ma'am, I record all over the world." She says, "You don't record here." Of course he did anyway, but he had this. Of course he could. He could everywhere. And the Bam, that's right. He was. I'll send you to jail. Renato's philosophy of being. Renato had a reputation for being an extremely severe judge. I was just reading. That shows you how much judges work in Italy, I guess. But not only was he. Renato had a busy life. He got up very early, went to the courthouse, stayed. He would never take a break. Stay until like 2, come home, have a large lunch, drink a bottle of wine, get in pajamas and go to sleep. Close the shutters, go to bed. And then he'd get up and go to concerts. Come back, go out after concerts start at 9. Come back, go to bed never before 2 or 3 in the morning. Or he'd go to Mantova, Brescia, which are an hour and a half away. And so it'd be really late nights. He'd get up and go to court. How he stayed awake in court, maybe he didn't. But Renato's, in Italy they don't have trial by jury. It's just a panel of 3 judges who decide. And they have to write a decision, which becomes grounds for appeal. Of course, then he was he was the head of the Court of Appeals. But Renato said to me once, he said, "Look, if they've gotten as far as to get to me, they've done something. Even if they haven't done what they're accused of, they're guilty of something." So, he said, you should never absolve anyone. They're all guilty of something or other.
Well, the thing is that what's amazing is his colleague was Aldo Moro, who was found in the trunk of a car, if I remember, almost 40 years ago?
Yeah. Actually, Renato's close colleague was Borelli, the 2 judges who were blown up in Sicily, Borelli and Borelli wasn't blown. Borelli was the public minister, what we would call like the attorney general, who was a very close friend. And this is a typical thing. When Borelli would come visit us in Piazza Borromeo, Renato's house in the middle of Milan, he would come an hour before he came. They would come and sweep the apartment with bugs to make sure there was no people, and they would put sharpshooters on the roof and in the piazza. Renato lived that way every day, never had anybody. He said, if they're going to kill me, at least they'll just kill me. If I have bodyguards or things like that, they'll kill them too. So, and he died of a heart condition. So he never. I have to say he was never ever. My mother was afraid, and I don't think she quite realized how scary it was sometimes to be in his house. But so he became really more a book collector, but the fate of his tapes when he died, he never had made a proper catalog. His desire was that everything would go to La Scala, but there'd be a special place for it where accredited scholars or people with interest could listen to things. They would all be on computer cataloged and they could listen to things. But because he died without having made a proper catalog, and because La Scala, understandably in today's world, is very worried about copyright infringements or people's privacy infringements, you'd have to go through the whole thing one by one and say, what is free, what is not, whom you'd have to get permission from, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just all sitting in deposit. Luckily, some of his friends I'm not a collector myself, but some of his friends do have a lot of his collection. But we're talking, of course, about tens and tens of thousands of hours of music. So, and they're extraordinary treasures. A lot of them came out in records, but a lot of them didn't. And it was a lifetime passion, and for his. He had extraordinary prejudices in music. He was an incredibly difficult judge. He would always talk about there's a special place in hell for bad pianists and for singers who sing out of tune. You really didn't want to be, you didn't want to have a bad night when Renato was in the hall. I remember that I could give lots of anecdotes of this sort, but here's one with Polini. You know, this is a very close friend of Renato's, very, very close friend of Renato's. And so Polini played, I think it was Beethoven Fourth, and a little accident happened right after the cadenza in the first movement. It was a good performance, though, with Abbado at La Scala. So we go backstage, and Renato says, "Too bad about that stecca, that horrible mistake after the cadenza." And Polini said, "Is that the only thing you heard, Renato?" I know the feeling very well. One other thing before I get to myself with Renato. Besides Renato's becoming a very, very powerful judge, Renato, I think, to his great sorrow afterwards, got very, very involved in the politics of La Scala itself. He became very famous. There was the Panorama, which would be like Time magazine, ran a great big story in which they said, this man is very strange, he's a judge, and yet the rumors fly. They say he conducts an orchestra in New Orleans. Now, where they got this, I don't know, but it said this, you know, because he was always going to the United States, I guess, but he certainly didn't conduct any orchestras anywhere. But I don't know if any of you followed at all from far away what happened with Muti at La Scala when Muti ended up losing his position at La Scala because there was sort of a revolt of the orchestra players. And Renato was very deeply involved in that, and it ruined his friendship with Muti. Renato was friends with Muti and with the Sovrintendente. I don't know how to even translate that name. How do we call it? What Rudolf Bing was to the Met, what Peter Gelb is to the Met. General manager, yeah. Who's Carlo Fontana, who's a good friend of mine too. And Muti decided to get rid of Fontana right before his term was up in any case, because he wanted to have his own guy for reasons of his own. And Renato got very, very outraged by the whole thing and found all this very negative stuff about the guy that he wanted to replace. He would actually go to La Scala with material he had rounded up from his various judicial sources about how this guy had bankrupted this and done this. And so it became very ugly. And that was I think Renato regretted that he'd ever gotten involved. But he had this extremely strong sense of justice. I mean, that was part of his personality, this judge thing. So let's listen to a couple of my things here. Well, at least one. We have time for the Ondine, don't we? Yeah, we got both. Oh, I don't know about that. So this is from Stresa. There's a great music festival that still exists. Stresa is Italian on Lago Maggiore, where Toscanini had his house in the island. And so they do concerts in that house, actually. But this is not. This is at a different place. I remember that it was absolutely pouring night, cats and dogs. It would be September of 1970. It was right after the competition. So it could be 78, 77 or 78. So this is Ondine from Gaspard Lelandry. That was, I remember the hall very well. Renato was angry because he didn't have a good place to record from, he thought. But I think the recorded sound is good, actually. And I was worried, I remember the rain would spoil it, but you can't hear the rains, which is good. So, anyway, we have time, we'll do one more, and then we can talk about, maybe. The night is young. Well, we could play the whole record. I mean, this is not such good sound. This is from La Fenice. It's an encore. I'm playing this is one that, Joe, had you heard the Odin before?
No, it's very good.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's good too. So they made a record of it about 20 years later. It's what happened. That's,
Is that on Academy, the one on Academy?
yeah, I think so.
Arcadia.
Arcadia.
Arcadia. Arcadia.
So anyway, this is from the same record. The record's called Ritratto di Virtuoso Giovane, Portrait of the Young Virtuoso. I was a young virtuoso. I was young, at least, anyway, then. I was, 24, 25 when I made these. So this is, Fufole, this is, they're like two of the hardest pieces ever written for piano you're getting tonight. The Ondine is certainly right up there. Fufole became famous because when I was a kid, I read an interview of Horowitz. Somebody said, was his transcription of something the hardest thing ever written? And he said, oh no, the hardest thing ever written for piano was Fufole. So of course, we all had to learn it, at least I did. So this is an encore of Fufole from La Fenice. I played Chopin E minor, right, Bells? Chopin, this was an encore, yeah, so. Sound is bad. That's good. anyway, actually, it's profoundly depressing for me to listen to these.
Why is that, Rita?
Because it's so damned good. That's why. Because I don't play that way anymore. Anyway, so did you know that one, Joe?
Oh, yeah, sure. And I agree with you. It would be nice if the sound were better.
Well, you know, there is one which is I think maybe even a better performance, but right in the middle somebody drops something very loud, so they use
That
this.
can be fixed.
Yeah, well, it couldn't be then, perhaps, but anyway.
Yeah, at that time you couldn't.
Yeah, that was from a performance in Trieste, like the next year, or around the same time. But anyway, yeah, it's too bad the sound's not better, but that's,
But they caught the timbre very, very well.
yeah. No, he caught the timbre very, very well, yeah. And this, you know, because La Fenice, so he's from a box, not, you know, probably Bells, were you sitting with him? Do you remember? I don't think so. Yeah. Were you actually in the orchestra? This is my wife who was at that concert. You were in the orchestra, and Renato was in a box, so you weren't together. He always, if he could, sat in a box because it was he needed,
Jeff, is that the disc that has the Tausig Gypsy song
yeah,
on it?
yeah.
Yeah, I do have that disc.
Well, can I see it? Did you have me there?
I mean, with the reverse,
Yeah,
negative on the
yeah. The photos were backwards on the front, which is interesting. It has Petrushka, which is from, gosh, could be Rome, Florence. Yeah, late 70s. The record didn't come out until late 80s, or even a little bit later, about right 19. What's the date on the record? I can't read. 91, yeah. Gaspar is from Streza, which you heard some. The Fufole, oh, there's a Mephisto waltz from I don't know where. Could have been from any number. Maybe from Brescia, but I've recorded that piece a lot. Then that's right. So Goinerweisen, Tausig, that would have been more like 1980. Renato was always trying to get me to learn these virtuoso pieces. That might have been Milan, actually. The fourth scherzo is the best performance on this record. That's a really good performance, actually. That's an encore, actually, in Milan. It's just too long to play. And then there's a Chopin, Opus 10 number 8 etude, which is, I don't remember where that's from. There's quite a few records that they came out of me playing live performances from Renato's tapes. There's a Bach performance, which was never put on CD, unfortunately, only on LP, which was one of the more memorable moments of my life. It was my first recital at La Scala, and an all Bach program, which is scary enough as it is. And as I began the second piece on the program was the C minor toccata, which is famous because Martha Argerich plays it a lot. And as I got into the slow part, which is near the beginning, I saw right through that part of my eye Pellini come in and sit at a box. This was the first time that Pellini, he had been on the jury of my competition, but he'd never come to any of my concerts. And this was the night where we became friends, actually, at concert. I immediately had a memory lapse. Although it's on the record, it's tiny, it's not a big deal, but it was not happy to see him. I mean, well, as Renato always pointed out, artists are always delighted to see other artists after the concert. But they're not happy to, when you come running backstage just before the concert, Pellini's here, or Martha Argerich is coming. Martha doesn't make anybody nervous, she's just Martha. But Pellini, then it, and unnerves you. And Renato unnerved people. Isaac Stern stopped a concert and asked, he didn't want Renato not to tape it because he wanted to have the tape, but he didn't want him to be so visible right in the front. Another thing is, there is a source of some of these tapes, Luca Chierici, used to go to concerts. He didn't tape them because Renato was taping them, but he would bring scores of the music, sit in the front row, and they were not just like small scores, they were these big library scores, like this, and he would ostentatiously be turning the pages right in front of the artist. And you're playing something like the Hammerklavier by memory, and you've got somebody turning, it's very, very disconcerting. This is not, and that's happened to me too, so that's not with Luca, with someone else, but that isn't any fun. Renato, in that respect, I mean, even though he spent all of his life with performing musicians and knew them well, and he would say things which are absolutely true. For instance, he would say, it's useless to tell the performer about a mistake he made or she made because no one knows as well as, I guarantee you, we're more aware of them than anybody in the audience is of the mistakes. But he did it himself. So he may have known, but he couldn't resist saying, oh, what a lovely performance. Too bad you messed up that passage in the third movement, kind of thing. He specialized in saying that, especially right after the concert and when 10 other people were in the dressing room. So, and none of them had noticed that you had messed up that passage. But then immediately they went home and told their friends, their wives, whatever, oh, Swann played well, but he really messed up a passage in the last movement. And of course, nobody's interested in the fact that you played well. But by the next day, all anybody knew about the concert was Swann really messed up a passage in the last movement. And that's, you know, that's just the way it goes. Okay, so anybody want to ask a question or say anything?
I'd like to add something
Go ahead.
about the Rye Ring in Rome, the Furtwängler Rye Ring.
He must have heard that.
I got some of those operas from Renato without any Kaka-moisms.
CACCAMO.
And I would have brought the Siegfried simply because at the end of Act One, in the Notung, Suithouse gets lost briefly, and he and Furtwängler are not together, but they do recover before the end. And it's really superb, and the audience goes absolutely wild. It's like Bobby Thompson hitting a home run. When the discs were released, it was not all from that broadcast performance. And in the case of the end of Siegfried, they substituted on the EMI discs the dress rehearsal performance with no mistakes, but the audience did not go wild either. It was just not the same degree of excitement in that. But I also think the story that Seth has told me about Renato letting a friend use his apartment, I think you ought to tell that.
Well, the story that you heard it is not accurate, but I can't get too accurate with that story because I don't want to get into Renato's personal life. But the essence of the story is that he allowed somebody into his apartment for one purpose, and Renato came home.
With a lady friend.
We have to change this. That's not true. That's also
could
not,
be, I-
that's not true
The
already.
story, well, from what, all right, then we could do it this way. It essentially was somebody came to him and said, you know, I'm carrying on this affair. I heard the story that it was a married woman, and she lived at the other end of town. Do you mind if we borrow the keys to your apartment while you're in court? And he said, sure. But he had his minions who would see what was going on. Oh, it was the doorman? Sure. Okay. And he was always inquisitive to find out what was going on. And he found out that they were there like 4 or 5 times a week. He said, boy, this is some hot affair. What he didn't know was that they were in his apartment taping his tapes and leaving him copies and taking the originals with him. And did this for quite a while. And I think he found out down the road concerning that. But that's one of the great stories. Like an urban legend, take it for what it is, who it may have actually have been, but it's along that
Well,
line.
it's easy. You know, Renato lived, he moved where he was living when you visited him, the Ottoboni. He moved away in '74, and he lived in an apartment in the very center of Milan. I mean, the original apartment was about 2,500 square feet, and then the one behind added another 1,500, I'd say. But it was like a fortress. It was the only apartment on the floor. And the building it's right near the Milan stock market, and the building was banks otherwise. So this building was literally like living in a fortress. So anybody going into that apartment was under tremendous surveillance. So it was very hard to get away with. And the only reason one of the very saddest things is that as long as Renato was alive and active, I didn't have anything to worry about practicing. Renato would play his tapes live. I mean, when the upstairs neighbors, whom he didn't get along with, complained about something, he would, play his music at 3 in the morning with the speakers right up against the ceiling. He would do really terrible things. But of course, once Renato then was really sick, then they started complaining about my practicing. Not before. Nobody dared before. But there were it was mostly banks and offices, and it was a perfect. It was a 5-minute walk from La Scala. 5-minute walk from the Duomo. It's right in the heart of Milan. And it was my home, basically. I mean, I had the keys and came when I wanted for basically from 1975 until he died in 2011. So it was a fantastic, a huge chunk of my life. There are a lot of, besides being a conductor in Rome. Now, an apartment that Renato had that really was used almost exclusively as a place for illicit lovers' meetings was his apartment in Paris. That really was used that way. But I don't think he kept very many tapes and things there. I think that was mostly in Milan. But everybody stole from. To hear Renato, everybody stole from him. They're all thieves. All collectors are thieves. And there's.
You mean it doesn't happen just here in the United States?
He would say,
Really?
"Una brutta razza, sono tutti ladri." It's a how we translate. It's an ugly race. They're all thieves. And of course, I felt like saying, it takes one to know one, but of course I didn't.
78? No. We, as Gary Thalheimer and I spoke about it, it's not so much, the 78 collectors were one breed, but I saw the tail end of it, and Gary was involved with the tape pirates, the ones who would collect the live performances. Later, again, we're talking once you had home machines, quarter-track machines came in and tape became cheaper, that all of a sudden, what did we say? You finished the sentence one time. I said, you think about it, that in New York City itself, starting, say, about 1950, when people had the money and started recording, you had, based on the radio, the New York Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Opera every week, the NBC Symphony until it went off in 54. You also got relays from the Boston Symphony occasionally and other things.
You got
But-
Chicago, and the other thing in New York, which is rare because it coincided in terms
Right.
of Sunday afternoons
Was
with
the
the
Frick.
Philharmonic, the Frick Museum
Museum.
on WNYC.
See, that's why you can't find, you can find New York Philharmonic broadcasts because everybody tuned into that from, what the heck was it? It was 3 o'clock to 4:30 on the air. The Frick Museum started at 4 o'clock.
No, it was also 3 to 4:30.
Oh, 3 to 4:30? I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
thought it was 4. So the thing was that there were more people recording the Philharmonic. No one was really interested in Frick. What? Who wants to hear Zaghetti and Schnabel?
Yeah.
I can
remember
listen to the Philharmonic and Bruno Walter.
People have had two tuners, they were doing enough crazy people to do that.
The two tuners? Well, you had to have a lot of money. Plus the fact if it's before tape, you had to have 2 sets of disc cutters or even the tape recorders. Gary, what the heck did an Ampex run back at, say, about 1950 when it was introduced?
An inexpensive Ampex ran roughly $1,200.
Mind you, you were...
There was a Pentron, which was a really rotten machine,
Oh,
for $99 or $129, on which people would record things at 78 inches,
Well,
7/8 of an inch per second.
1 7/8. Yeah, they would go
One-
down that
yeah.
slow. But Tandberg came in later. Tandberg doesn't come on the market. Yeah, they don't come onto the market until almost the late 50s. They're introduced, and that was the alternative to the Ampex. And they also came out with the X60. Right, but the thing was, that was the first machine that was a competition to Ampex, which was not introduced until the late 50s. And that you also not only had a half-track, but a quarter-track machine. Now, Ampex didn't want to go into that until much later, where they made, I had one of those machines with the tubes. That literally, when you wanted to play back the different tape configurations, you pulled up on the tape head, and it went from half-track to quarter-track with a big transient as you did it. But the point was, all these things, and as like Gary and I said, we were spoiled in New York. Everything was coming off the radio. And then, something that drives me nuts, 1957, 58, 58, 59, WBAI every Saturday night broadcasting the live or tape delay of the Chicago Symphony under Reiner, Bruno Walter, Montignon, Giulini came through, Stokowski. Nobody can find a complete run of these confounded things. Right, Al? We can't find certain concerts.
Almost something popping up.
Popping up, but not...
Like with Reiner Messiah, which I'd never seen.
Right, a
Reiner
Reiner
Messiah.
Messiah, yeah.
Wow.
Or an Emperor Concerto with the Hungarian, what's his name?
Serkin?
No, Hungarian. Kentner with Reiner, done in like Christmas. It's never shown up. It's on the same concert that someone found the Schubert Great C Major Symphony, the only time he did it. These kind of oddball things. Can't find these. For some reason, stuff wasn't recorded, possibly because at that time CBS was also broadcasting. The Philharmonic went to Saturday night starting, I think, in 58, 59. And they would broadcast the whole thing.
It was much later than that.
No, 58, 59, I have stuff. That complete concerts, instead of just doing 75 minutes, were on the air. And they were Saturday nights.
How much did Inagra Just out of curiosity, Renato had the Nagra machines. How much
Joe,
did they cost?
How much does a Nagra go?
How much did it go for when he bought them back then?
Depends which model.
He had I'm sure the most expensive model you could get.
What year are we talking about?
70s?
Early 70s, late 60s.
Probably a 4S. That was a very expensive machine. It was probably 9, 10 grand.
That was a
Then.
lot of money.
Yeah. That's a year's income for most people.
Yeah.
No, 'cause I remember when I first got into this nonsense and,
Nonsense.
and I was salivating over the 4S because it was by far the best reel-to-reel recorder you could buy that didn't weigh 300 pounds.
Right.
It weighed plenty though, because I can remember carrying it.
It wasn't quite that big.
No, weighed.
Suitcase size.
Yeah, that's right. It weighed maybe
Yeah.
40, 50
Yeah,
pounds.
but
Yeah.
this was a very, very expensive hobby. Tape was what?
Tape was very expensive at that time.
What the hell was it
10-inch
about?
reel of
Yeah.
Scotch tape without flanges was approximately $20.
Wow.
Now, mind you, this is
And the flanges
1954.
were an additional $6 or so. So you bought the tape without flanges and you
Even
kept
when
changing.
When portable cassettes came in.
They were
late
expensive.
70s, they were so expensive.
Yeah.
That what collectors would do is pirate concerts on cassette and then transfer them to reel, so they could
Right.
reuse the cassette.
Cassette, just like the early days of DAT when it was so expensive.
More ridiculous.
Oh, well, what about DATs? When they go in and pirate something, then they would copy the DAT to a cassette or reel-to-reel, and then reuse the DAT. By the time they used it about 20 times the Sony block error rate, you put it in, it was all noise because it couldn't retrieve anything anymore. But the point we're getting to is that in New York, we were spoiled. I mean, people in Chicago, Boston, somewhere else were dying to find these sources. Here, we'd flip on an FM tuner, get a clean signal, record it, and you had it. And as Gary said, because he was involved with a lot of these characters, there must have been about 40, maybe 50 people in the New York City area that were actively collecting live broadcasts on tape of whatever sort, most, of instrumental, orchestral, the Met operas and all that. And what was your famous line to that? Not one of them was talking to each other.
Yeah, they all knew who the others were,
Right,
and none of them talked to each other.
right.
And people out of town did not know any other collectors in their area,
Yeah.
and were dying to have someone to talk to about tapes and taping and
They were-
concerts.
That's why, memory, when we did that roundtable, Willie Learned Music Masters, he had a mailing list of these people all over the country who were dying to get these things. And we're going to pay for the stuff he put on used toilet paper tape, and it had lousy sound at like $25 an item that filled up half a track because they couldn't get it any other way. Am I right?
Yeah.
And of course, there's the classic story. One day I'll do it because of these collections coming in. There was a pirate by the name of Roger Frank who had put out the Penzance label. The man was not like Renato. He was absolutely brilliant. He was a musician. He had an ear. He knew how to work with tape recorders and turntables. And he put out a label called Penzance Records. Some of you may remember it. He was the first one to put out the Falstaff with Toscanini from Salzburg. And what he had was an entree from somebody at NBC Radio to borrow discs out of there. And he would pick them up at Willie Lerner's Music Masters. And it was through a couple of other collectors because they weren't getting stuff. Instead of coming to him and say, listen, get me the stuff, they ratted on him. And one day he went to pick up the thing, and the guy's standing there white as a ghost. He said, what? He said, someone did a surveillance outside of Willie's shop and saw you come in and pick up a package after I had just left the same package. And they told me if I do it anymore, I'd get fired. But he was able to get stuff out of there. And it was just absolutely amazing the material he would borrow to put out, that he put out on his labels. But he was another one. He was the one that got out of the NBC files the Salzburg Festival material, the Toscanini Falstaff, the Bruno Volta, Nozze di Figaro, and Don Giovanni, which had been dubbed from the Selenophone films onto 16-inch discs by either NBC or Library of Congress in 1942, and then they dismantled the machine they had and didn't bother with it. He found those discs and taped them. And a bunch of us here who know a famous clarinetist from Brooklyn by the name of Jerome Goldstein, right, Joe? He told me one time, he says, I was done in by the Don. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I got copies of those operas, and I had them on my shelf, and then Warren Lawrence came by, who worked for Willie and also was part of Good Sound Associates. And Warren was kind of a down-and-out character, and he looks, he said, Jerry, do you mind if I copy these? He said, I had a moment of weakness, I let him borrow it. He said, within a year, 3 pirates put it all out. He said, CJ, who gave it to him, didn't speak to him for 6 months. Roger Frank never gave him another thing again. Roger was the equivalent of CACCAMO. He was terribly paranoid, you know, like, everybody's stealing my stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
one
Yeah,
part of
that
Renato,
was the
in Renato's
equivalent.
defense about one thing, Renato,
Yeah.
the agreement he had with La Scala, and the stuff I've looked at, the Scala, they said nothing can come out, not from the theater. So there's lots of Scala stuff, but it's usually runouts or things like that. Now, some of it he got permission, I mean, but like the Cala stuff is not La Scala stuff. She didn't do that much at La Scala, actually.
Right.
And so, you know, like, for instance, I had a bunch of things like Pellini and Abato, or Ashkenazi and Abato, Guido and Kramer, but from La Scala. So it's not, the only copies that he would give me are like runouts in Pavia or runouts in Brescia, but not stuff actually.
Not from the hall itself.
No, because he knew that if he would, you know, he was a judge also. It would be kind of,
He had a legal obligation because he was a counsel.
Yes, he actually was, and one of the reasons, I guess, the thing that made Renato's sort of salon different was the fact that he knew personally so many of these people, because I mean, he really started off largely, I think, making copies for the artists. The one thing Renato did say that he says the only ones that he would trust were the artists themselves, because he knew they weren't going to go especially in that was because they were artists all hated pirated records because they weren't getting royalties from them, of course, or they also had no control. And there were also, as you probably all of you are aware, especially when there was what was it, the mid '80s, when there was just this explosion of pirate because the laws were liberalized, late '80s. People were publishing records of artists purposely, famous artists, so they would sell a certain amount because the artist was famous enough, but of bad performances as punitive things. They were mad. I know of one that actually came from Renato's collection, but he had no idea it was going to end up this way, of 2 performances of Maurizio Pollini with orchestra from the 60s. And Pollini went through a really bad time in the 60s, and there's a Beethoven Third and something else, Schumann Concerto, and they're just awful. But you know, I mean, they came out in France. They came out one of those French pirated companies, and actually
name a dozen.
yeah, and you know, I remember, and it was actually even got good. Of course, it got a good review because it had Pollini's name on it. I remember that Renato was astonished because, like, it got from Diapason or the other magazine some great review.
Or
But
an
it-
award yet
it-
on top
yeah,
of it.
yeah, but it was a terrible performance. And you know, I mean, you had no defense as an artist. People could publish absolutely anything.
All right, any questions before we wrap it up?
You mentioned his stuff when.
Wait a minute, hold on a second. Gary, can I have that mic? Yeah, just pull it out of the... Thank you. Hold on.
You have to go to posterity here.
Yeah, now you're on tape. Now we're gonna have...
I've got to be careful. So you said his archives went to La Scala, and his vision was to have it sort of available. Is that still possible, or no?
Well,
one can
in
hear?
theory, yes. If somehow there would be a provision that somebody could go in, they'd have to go in and actually listen to, you know, or at least to see all the stuff that's there. And I think that there are 4 different categories of things. And if somebody could just even do the division of the categories, a great deal of material is the material like what we heard Layla singing the aria, you know, things like that. Now, those are of enormous interest, but obviously not, you know, you can't publish things like that. That's, you know, it's in someone's private home, but they're extremely important as documents of society. If someone were going to write a history of what was going on culturally in Milan in the second half of the 20th century, Renato and his life would be an unbelievable treasure trove. But there are then there are other ones which have already come out on records. There's no particular reason, but excuse me?
Was he good about labeling stuff?
Early on, terrific, then got worse and worse. And his handwriting, you could attest to that. Renato had some of the I got used to it, but he had terrible handwriting. This little tiny, very small and scrunched together. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, I can still picture. Yes, and but things became really out. It became a monster. I think one of the reasons he also sort of stopped collecting is it overwhelmed him, and there were. The person who had close access to Renato's collection, they kept publishing records from it, with Renato's permission, right until almost Renato's death. Hans Peter, I can't remember, is a Viennese guy who's founded the company Mito, Mito, which was in Italy initially, and then they moved to Croatia because they changed the pirating laws in Italy. And Hans Peter, all that, those are, there's not, if there's a record published by Mito, that's not from Renato's collection, I'd be astonished. I think they're all from his collection.
Stradivarius and Arcadia.
Yeah.
So is that stuff all digitized at least if it's not sorted?
Some of it is digitized. He himself was technologically from the analog, from the Nagra era. As people gave him a DAT machine. He actually was given, that was a lot of his stuff he got in exchange for tapes. Nikos gave him a DAT machine.
Did he use it?
Yeah, he did actually. Renato did use it. So there's a portion of his collection that did get digitized, but it would take a lot of work. It would be a neat job. I mean, imagine someone's doctoral dissertation. They could, just putting together his collection, but it would be even sadder because at least they're there and nothing's going to happen to them bad. His book collection ended up. Except for the scores. He had a terrific collection of scores, most of which don't have any really great interest, but he had a lot of rare opera scores. And those ended up either at the Casa Verdi, the house that Verdi founded in Milan for retired singers, or in conservatories. But his art books and things like that, they just carried them away in trucks and sold them on the streets. And things which is, if you collect something as precious treasures all your life, and they end up, but that's his nephew inherited the apartment, he wanted everything out, so.
Any other questions?
Hello. Several years ago, La Scala started issuing operatic performances, and then all of a sudden they stopped. Do you know the reason?
Copyright. I bet there were union. I don't know for a fact. I'm no longer inside La Scala to the extent that I was during a period of like 20, 25 years. But my guess would be they ran into union issues.
I can answer that because I reviewed one for Arts Journal. The company issuing it was not really La Scala. They were using the La Scala name. Yes, that's right. And the one that I reviewed was an exact duplicate of the EMI release. Exact.
Well, La Scala only started having their own archive in the late 90s. Renato kept on recording everything at La Scala, but so that strikes me as remarkably late that they would start. La Scala has also a fantastic museum, which Renato was very instrumental, and his friend Ade in putting together. That's if you go to Milan, you should definitely visit the Scala Museum. Yeah.
Is there any way that we could hear the entire Furtwängler performance?
How much of you have here? I don't know. That was it. That's it.
But is
Well, no, we had.
But is there any other
There are
way?
two other excerpts that I have on that tape. One is the end of Rheingold, except in very poor sound for some reason, and either Sattler, who is singing Loge, is so far beyond his career that he's practically speaking it and in a very high voice. And the other bit is the beginning of Siegfried,
So what you're
and is
saying
also
we
not
could
in
not
as good
hear-
sound as
we could not
that
hear-
Valkyra.
How did you get that?
Yeah. Renato had, I can tell you some of the things. When Renato wanted to listen to, which early on was all the time, when he would put on tapes of his, of Wagner's, he had certain things which were just like his really special treasures. There's, the first scene of the third act of Siegfried with Hans Hotter, and who was the Höfgen? I can't remember who the contralto was, the Erda. Especially though the prelude and then the entrance of Hotter. But I don't think that's Furtwängler. I don't think Furtwängler ever conducted a Siegfried with Hans Hotter, did he?
No.
I don't think so. I think it might be
No,
Clemens.
it was
That might have been.
Franz and Joseph
Yeah,
Hermann.
I think this was Clemens Krauss, actually. Some of these became records finally. That Clemens Krauss Bayreuth thing became a record.
Yeah.
Renato had also fantastic sources from German radio, from East German radio, from he got a lot of stuff from those people. He'd come home from his trial and there'd be huge boxes, and he'd be all excited, this stuff from coming in from them. And
There
so,
were also things he had gotten from Russia.
Yeah.
Because he was on some trips to Russia, and got some things.
most of his scores, for one thing, he got in
Yeah.
Russia. He had all these rare opera scores.
There's one of those things that, one of those things in Russia that Jürgen Grundheber saw, who was also a close friend of CACCAMO's, was a Tannhäuser conducted by Furtwängler from the Berlin State Opera. And that has never turned up or been, in quotes, returned by the Russians when they were supposedly returning all the material they had gotten in Germany.
Maybe they'll put it out.
Well, I wish they would.
There are two labels that have been coming out with stuff like mad for the last couple of years. One of them is Aquarius in Russia, but that's usually Russian stuff. And the other is the Hamburger Archive that has something like 1,300 issues out. And I'm a collector of this stuff, and I'm seeing operas all over the place in glorious sound that I've never seen anywhere before, like Merry Wives of Windsor with Gerhard Hirsch, things like that. You know, so when you said that he had access to German recordings, I wonder if that's how they've gotten some of them.
One thing I remember he loved, I mentioned to him one time, this is flooding back memories, that I had never heard a performance of Freischütz. And he found a Freischütz with Furtwängler, and also and we were comparing that with the Freischütz with a very young Carlos Kleiber. It was a very interesting, very different approaches to the piece, obviously.
Well, believe it or not, Russia put out a highlights from Freischütz. It's an acted version with about an hour of music. From 1937, not from Moscow or Leningrad, but from some faraway place like, you know, the lower Arctic or something, but they put it out, so these things are around somewhere.
Yes, and things keep turning up. In my bulletin this month, or the December one, there are two things on the Audita label, one of which is a Manfred overture by Furtwängler from Lucerne, which had been missing. The rest of the program, a Schumann symphony and the Eroica, had been available. Now they have found the Manfred, which had been missing, in a Swiss archive. And also from Rios, a batch of Bolet performances from Rios. And several of the labels are now in direct contact with some of the radio station archives who are going through their archive material and finding things like SWR of the Southwest German broadcast.
Yeah, there's a label, Joe, the one that put out all that piano material, Mellow something or other? Mellow Classics. There.
That's a current label.
Currently, yeah, but they have found,
They found a lot of very.
they found broadcasts in all of these archives of pianists and instrumentalists that nobody had ever seen before.
Do you know of
Yeah.
many recordings made by a pianist called Orloff? Nikolai Orloff.
Yeah, I understand they're putting them out.
Well, Renato had a lot. That's probably from him indirectly. Renato, that was his first great enthusiasm as a pianist. I mean, at the same time he discovered Furtwängler in Rome, he discovered Orloff in Rome, and Cortot, of course. But Quarteau is a known quantity, but Orloff was not
Well, he
to me.
was the one that probably was the source of all that late life Courteau that came out on, what was it, Hunt or Arcadia?
Oh,
back
that's completely for Renato. Hunt Arcadia, that's
then? Yeah,
Renato.
when
That's
those things came
Nikos,
out,
yeah.
people said live
Yeah, but
Courteau.
that's supposed to be, some of that's supposed to be bogus, like the Chopin Mazurkas.
No. We're talking about CDs that were broadcast from Berlin that he did live without an audience. There were two or three CDs of
Yeah.
Chopin.
Yeah. Those Nikos produced from Renato's tapes.
So
right.
those were from
Yeah.
Renato.
Right.
Okay, it all goes back to him. Any other questions? We need to wrap up. We're done? Gentlemen, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. They deserve a great round of applause.
I'm glad we did this.
Yeah.
Me too.
I mean,
You want to add anything?
Renato was a great guy. I mean, that's,
Well, I'd like to add something in the way of a thank you to Jeffrey, but also to Seth for what he did with the material that he
yes.
had.
Thank you.
Thank you. What? Come back soon. Oh, yeah, encore. Yeah, right.
Well,
See him speaking at Parsifal in February, right?
I will be speaking on Parsifal in February, yeah.
And speaking of February, speaking of February, our next meeting is going to be on the 15th. Matt Barton from the Library of Congress is going to be presenting the artist Bobby Robinson. So I wish you all a good evening. Stay warm. And let us hope we don't get snowed in or frozen by the next meeting in February. See you then, and thank you for coming.
Bye-bye.